This lecture is about Greek word studies. The purpose of this lecture is to learn how to interpret Scripture, the New Testament in particular, as it was written in Greek. And so the focus is on Greek word studies, but we also need to say something about the idea of word studies that would apply to the Old Testament or to any language study. Let's begin, though, with a theological answer to the question, why do word studies? It's one thing to talk about word studies in various languages. It's another to apply this discussion to the study of Holy Scripture. And so we begin by noting that God's communication is through his written word. Two passages might be considered alongside of the many passages in Scripture that could draw our attention to this point. The Shema, which is taken from Deuteronomy 6:4 through 7, was a prayer said daily by Jews. And the passage in Deuteronomy reads this way: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk in the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. On this slide, some words are in red, and they point to the idea of the importance of communication. God did not reveal himself with a video recording that we could then discuss. He revealed himself in written communication, and his written word then becomes something that we study, and that study has to take place with the original languages if we are to get to the meaning of those words. From the New Testament, we can consider a famous passage in 2 Timothy. The chapter break interrupts the flow of thought, and I want to read from 3:16 through 4:2. All Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, equipped for every good work. I charge you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. Again, the words in red point to the communication of God being in written word. All scripture, all graphe, all writing that is in Holy Writ is breathed out by God. This is where we get the idea of the inspiration of Scripture, the divine inspiration of Scripture, because it is breathed out by God. And then that means that we can use it for certain purposes, for teaching, reproof, correction, training in righteousness. And then again in 4:2, to reprove, rebuke, and exhort with complete patience and teaching. We also read in verse 2 the command given to Timothy to preach the word. The word preach is keruxon. Keruso means to proclaim. And I would suggest avoiding the word preach in our translations of Scripture because we take a lot of baggage along with that word. We assume it means what we experience when someone delivers a sermon, and that may or may not actually be a proclamation of the word. The focus of proclaiming the word is the explanation of what the word says. Too often our preaching is focused on some application of what we might have read in Scripture, or even some values that we hold as a community. But the focus is on interpretation, right understanding, and proclamation of the Word of God. Turning then to academic answers to the question, why do word studies? We might say a few things up front. First of all, we want to get behind translations and look at the Greek. If translations were perfect, we wouldn't have to do this. If there was always only one option for translating a passage into another language, we wouldn't have to do this. But when we read Scripture in translation, we are reading a committee's, or sometimes an individual's, idea of one way to take that passage. There are other ways, though, and therefore our translations obscure the options. And since translations aren't perfect, we need to get behind our translations to look at the Greek. Now that applies to grammar as well as to the meanings of words. So while translations are right to translate words differently to convey the meaning and context as best as possible, different translations of a word can hide the connections between passages that have the same word in Greek. Take, for example, the word kaukasis in Greek, which means boast. In the NRSV, in Romans 15:17, we read this: "In Christ Jesus, then, I have reason to boast." Now, the ESV translation says, "Be proud of," instead of boast. In Christ Jesus, then, I have reason to be proud of. And the NIV translates this word kaukasis as glory in. So these three popular translations in English in our time have three options for kaukasis: to boast, to be proud of, or to glory in. Given Paul's important discussion of boasting in Romans, something is lost with the ESV and the NIV. In Romans 15:17, Paul's gospel perspective stands behind his theology of ministry here. Boasting is done in Christ, not in works. This we read way back in Romans 3, verse 27, and then in Romans 4:2, a few verses later. So the theological notion of boasting has already been developed in Romans before you get to Romans 15:17. And by dropping a translation that continues to use the word boast, you lose the connection with Romans 3:27 and 4:2. Studying Scripture in the original languages, though, gets us back in touch with how Paul is using the language to convey his theology. Why do word studies? Well, we can also say that we do them to see the connections between the New Testament authors and the Old Testament scriptures, both the Septuagint and the Hebrew. And this is an extension of the point just made about seeing the same word in a particular writing by a particular author. Here we're looking at the relationship between authors, and especially New Testament authors in their use of the Old Testament. Because when they're using the Old Testament, they're not just using language of a common community of the people of God. They're commenting, they're exploring the meaning of an actual text. They're engaged with the meaning of words. So, for example, while in English translations, the word dikaiosune is often translated with our English word justification, the use of this word in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, is important. They're not coming up simply with the word that's commonly used, and it is common in Greek. They're coming up with a word that we already see written in the Old Testament many times. The concept with whether it's a noun or a verb or an adjective and so on in the Old Testament needs to be explored in order to see what New Testament authors are doing with this word and this concept. So in the Old Testament, we see the Hebrew word tzedikah is a word that is translated with dikaiosune, and there it often suggests a moral aspect to the meaning. So instead of justification, the word might be translated as righteousness, as it often is. Our word dikaiosune is always translated with the idea of righteousness when Matthew uses it. But sometimes in Paul's writings, it gets translated as justification or as righteousness. And then we could also extend this discussion into the meaning of the verb that's related to this. Here, though, the point is that we need to be able to see the connections in a particular language between the New Testament authors and the Old Testament that is in Greek translation. Complicating this issue is the fact that the Old Testament exists originally in Hebrew and a few portions in Aramaic, and then it gets translated into the Septuagint, and New Testament authors are using all three of these languages at times. And they most often are using the Greek translation. So we get ourselves quite engaged with different languages when we do word studies in order to see how a New Testament author might be using a word, especially a theological word like dikaiosune. We also want to explore the range of meanings of a word. This is what a dictionary does. A dictionary will give you the basic meaning and then the extended meanings of a word. And that's true of Greek dictionaries that we use for translating the New Testament. Those dictionaries are sometimes called lexicons, and they may be lexicons for the Greek language during its classical period or during its New Testament period, where we call the Greek used Koine Greek there, or it could be after the New Testament where shades of meaning are moving beyond the way in which the Greek was used in the first century. We want to look at the basic meanings of words, but it may be that our passage is not using the basic meaning of a word and is using some extended meaning. When I say basic meaning, I mean things like the root meaning of the word, or the primary, or the literal, or the physical meaning of the word. Often words get used that way first of all. Take, for example, the word hammer. It's a thing. I can point to a hammer and say, that's a hammer. That's the basic meaning of the word hammer. But I can use that concept around a thing, the hammer, and apply it to something else, where people will sometimes say, it hammered us, maybe referring to a storm or something like that. There's an extended meaning of the basic meaning of hammer. The storm would be functioning somewhat like a hammer. It's a bit of a metaphor. It's symbolic. We can often see prepositions have some sort of basic physical meaning and then some more conceptual meaning. The word through can convey the idea of physically passing through something. But I can say that I communicated with you through letters, and that usage of through there is a more conceptual, extended meaning of the word through. The meaning of a word, then, is in a range of meanings, and we can only establish what the range of meanings is by looking at how the word is used by different authors or different cultures and in different times. Our word kaukema, like in the previous slide, having to do with boast, is typically translated as boast, but it can be some word that shades off into other meanings, as we saw, meanings like glory or exalt or pride or rejoice. And that's sometimes puzzling. We have to think a little while about how we can get from a word like boast in its most basic and most common usage to rejoice. Now, we also want to explore theological ideas. And here then we have the theological word study. Not all our words in our study for translation purposes are going to have theological meaning. But it's particularly the theological words that are interesting for exegetical purposes. Translation purposes, we need to know what words mean. Exegetical study of a passage gets us into the theological interpretation of texts. So, for example, kaukema is an important term for Paul in his discussion of the law and works and in his arguments with the Corinthians over ministry. While one learns little through a word study on this word, it's a common word after all, one can learn much about Paul's theology by focusing on how he's using this word kaukema in a particular letter or in his letters overall. Well, we need to stop and ask the question, how do words have meaning? We've been talking about this a bit, but perhaps with this slide we can highlight several different areas to consider in answering the question, how do words have meaning? And this then sets us up for how do we go about doing word studies. Over on the bottom left side of this slide, we have the author, and then at the top of the triangle we have the text, and the bottom right side we have readers. And there's a sense in which we answer the question of how do words have meaning by giving a focus around these corners of the triangle of an author, text, and readers. The author is constrained somewhat in the use of words and can't just decide to use words any way he might wish. And so there is, on the lexical dictionary side of things, a root meaning, as we just said in the previous slide, and then extended meanings or nuances. That can apply also to grammar. It can be that a basic meaning of a participle would be a verb that we add the letters ing to, running. But then there are nuances of this kind of a participle. While running, because of running, in order to run, and so on. The participle in Greek can be used in these different ways. And when we focus on purpose and the time of running and so on, we're nuancing the meaning. So there's the basic meaning and then the nuances. It applies in words and in grammar itself. And we can also then get an idea of what this word means by looking at cognates. Similar words, but not the exact same word. Meaning shades off in a different direction with other cognates. When we look up synonyms as well, we are doing the same thing. There's a shading of meaning. Then antonyms can help us where we say, well, this word is the opposite of that word. And so we can get an idea of what the word means by seeing its opposites. So just this basic lexical kind of study can help clarify the options of how a word could be used. There's also a grammatical side to this, not just the lexical side, but the grammar of a particular language determines how words can be given meaning. There are rules for this language's grammar, and we need to ask what are those and how do they apply to the meaning of words and their use. Then there's a syntactical use of words. Words, we might say that, ask how do words relate in this language? Example, in phrases and clauses. It's often pointed out that words do not have meaning on their own, but they have meaning in context. And so that applies to when we read a particular text. It's one thing to say, well, the dictionary says the word means this, or it could have these meanings. But the real question we're asking in a word study is, how is this word used in this particular author's writing, in this text, in this passage, in this sentence? And so any study of words that shows us all the options is going to be interesting and helpful, but not going to lead us to a final decision until we actually read what the text says in front of us. Another thing to consider is time in which a text is written, or the time in which an author is writing, because languages can have a change in meaning and usage over time. So we can talk about a diachronic and a synchronic approach to word studies. This is an extremely important point. We might consider this one of the most basic things to discuss and consider in doing a word study. A diachronic approach then would say, well, here's what the meaning meant in the earliest usage that we know of, and then here is now how the word is being used a few hundred years later, and then a few hundred years later, and so forth. So if we're studying another language and we're not native users of the language, we may well pick up the meaning of a word that is no longer in current usage. And when we study Scripture in the New Testament, we need to be careful that we don't assume that the way Plato was using the word 400 years before Christ is the way the word is still used in the first century. So the synchronic approaches the word study in terms of how is this word being used in the first century, or how is this word, or grammar even, being used in the first century in Israel by Jews versus in the first century in Alexandria by non-Jews. Now we can't always, in fact we rarely can get that specific, but it's quite clear that that is actually how languages work. And even from one generation to the next, in the same culture, in the same century, you find young people starting to use words a different way and give them new meanings. One of the classic examples in our own time might be how the word gay meant happy and free, and it came to be used of homosexuals, and that took over the meaning of the word, so that we don't use that word gay in that way anymore. Now, the textual consideration has already been noted. What this text says is what we're interested in. And then there's a communal constraint on the meaning of words. What this community means with its rhetoric, and I've mentioned that also in terms of the time. And then also the author. How does this author write using that word or even that grammar? A lot of what we're saying about words can be applied to grammar as well. This author likes this word. I mentioned Caucasus is a word that Paul likes to use. And so we do need to, although it's a very obvious basic meaning of boasting, the question is, how is he using the word? This then gets us beyond the dictionary meaning of the word to the use of the word by the author in the specific texts. And then finally, readers place a constraint on the meaning of words. We can't simply say that words have meaning that the author can create, but then readers aren't part of that meaning. Readers have to be able to understand, yes, that word does mean that way. Yes, in your use of the word that way, you have communicated something. So we need to be focused on what these readers would be likely to understand. This is often an interesting issue when we're reading New Testament authors who are using the Old Testament meaning of words as they write to Jewish and Gentile Christians in a particular community. It may well be that the Jews in the Christian church would understand that theological use of a Greek word from the Old Testament and may even have the very passage that someone like Paul has in mind in using the word that way. But it might be that the new converts who are perhaps Greek or Scythian or Roman those new converts might not have the same understanding of the word. And so this raises the question of how can they be brought into this community that is Bible-based, that is Old Testament-based in its very rhetoric and vocabulary, and how do they come to be shaped in a new way from the common usage of words. So just looking at this slide again, you can see that words have meaning not simply in a single sense, but there are multiple factors that shape the possible meanings of words. And these factors create a methodology for how we go about doing word studies. Our methodology is to ask all of these questions. And the resources that we have to do the word study are resources that build up around these different uses, these different issues. We have lexicons, we have grammars, we have advanced grammars that look at syntax. We have texts that we can identify according to their dates, whether they're 4th century BC or 2nd century AD. And we can begin to make distinctions diachronically, and we can focus in on 1st century usage synchronically. So we can look at texts and study words in terms of the texts that we can read. And then we can focus on the particular New Testament authors, the New Testament itself as a Christian community's vocabulary, and the early church as well as part of that. And then, therefore, the readers, the Christian readers, reading these documents. And that then creates for us the methodology and the tools for word studies. So let's look at this a bit more. So regarding method, when you have a passage that you're trying to exegete, you'll be looking for the words that you need to focus on for your word study. And so as you go about the work of translation, you're going to identify particular words that might require more in-depth study. You might find that some words are unusual words. Now, they may be unusual for you because your level of Greek isn't as advanced as a native speaker's. That's the case for all of us in Greek Bible translation, unless we're born in Greece. And even then, we aren't 1st century native speakers of Greek. So we might start circling words that look unusual to us, and then we might discover that it's not only us, but it's actually an unusual word. It might only be used once in the New Testament, for example, or it might be an unusual use of the word. And so those are the words we start to hone in on. Particularly words with disputed or various meanings are of interest to us as we go about our word studies. Key words, words that are absolutely essential for the meaning of this passage, even though we think we may know what they mean and may not even want to do a word study on them, we need to note those and say, well, the passage so depends on this word that I want to be sure that I'm not simply skimming over the meaning of that word because I know how to translate it, but I really have understood what's going on with this word here. Also, secondly, we want to study the factors that were listed in the previous slide that contribute to meaning, doing our own work first and using tools for that work for the word studies to check your findings. This point is an important point. Don't start with English translations. Start with your own work on translation. That way, when later you go on to look at how some translations have translated the passage and translated those words, you could say, well, that's interesting. That's not what I came up with. And that difference then creates the opportunity for deeper study. You could say, okay, I mistranslated that. Or, you know what? I think I'm onto something here. I'm not sure they got the right word there in that translation. The same thing applies to the use of commentaries and articles and books, which all represent scholars giving their interpretation. The more you can start with your own work first, the more you can have issues of exegesis arise that can be looked at. Whereas if you start with the interpretation of others, they may so lead you into their own understanding of the passage that you will never see the other option that you would have noticed had you just started with translating the passage yourself. This also goes for lexicons. Don't forget, lexicons are scholarly interpretations. Lexicons are the understanding that scholars have come to about the possible meaning of a word. But if you're actually looking at the available texts in Greek from antiquity, you're doing what the scholars do when they write their lexicons, their dictionaries. And so the more you're engaged with primary texts, not scholarly secondary works, the more you're going to, again, be attuned to possible differences in meaning. This does occur in the New Testament. It's not just a theoretical point, and some of the words I've suggested as options for study are words that could have different meanings from the way in which translations and scholars have taken them. So we have to ask with the lexicon, what meanings are available using the lexicons, but also looking at primary sources ourselves. The same thing needs to be done with basic grammars and advanced grammars, points B and C here. What meanings are there for the genitives, for the participles, for the adverbial participles? What meanings are there behind the different tenses? What is an aorist? Is aspect or is time more significant for an aorist indicative? Then syntactically, we look at relationships. How do these words work together in phrases and clauses? How do the prepositions work with the nouns? How do the nouns work with the genitives that are attached to them, and so forth? Syntax is where the real work of exegesis with words happens. That is, first year Greek helps you to understand basic meanings of words and basic use of grammar. But it's when we start getting deeper into the syntax that we see that there are lots of options out there. And it's because there are options that it's valuable to study Greek. If, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, there's only one option for translation, it's not even important to learn Greek. But where there are options, there's sometimes vagueness or sometimes alternative possibilities of translation and meaning, and that's where interpretation is important. And then we could also look, point D here, as was said in the previous slide, at time, diachronic and synchronic studies, or we can look at a textual focus where we're looking at this passage in this text. We can look at the community that's using Greek in the New Testament. They're a community that knows Hebrew and has an Old Testament Bible translated into Greek. They're Christians who are giving some new meanings to words because of being a separated community. So the communal aspect's important. Authorial aspect, how does this author use this word and relate words to each other? And then point H, the probable meaning for the audience. Is the meaning public, not private? And then finally, you move on to check your work with other scholarship. This is where, having done your own work in the word study, it would be valuable to see if others see what you see. You want to make sure that you're not going off on a limb that nobody else has ever said before, and that actually, when you think about it, isn't even a possibility. And so that's when you check your work with other scholarship. So all of this can be involved in a word study. What I want you to do for the assignment is to focus on everything up until your point 3. That is, I'm interested in your ability to apply the method of word study to the meaning of a word and to use the tools that scholars have developed for studying the meaning of words without getting involved in the actual interpretations of the scholars in commentaries, monographs, articles, and so forth. That is important in exegesis, in an exegesis paper, but for a narrower assignment that's teaching you method and tools, the third point here is not something in focus. A word about research and the presentation of your research. First, give evidence of your own research. Since the focus of this work is your own research, the more that you are dependent on others, the less valuable this assignment is. Secondly, give evidence of methodological awareness, that triangle with those different issues that have to be considered. Thirdly, give evidence of your use of language tools. And by here I mean things like lexicons, grammars, and theological word dictionaries in particular. Give evidence of checking your work with others. This is in the broader approach to doing word studies for exegesis, not so much the focus in the assignment. Give proof all along the way. Avoid simply claiming things. Avoid simply giving references to some authority without your own checking and showing it yourself. 6, clarify the big picture and sort the data. This word occurs 53 times in Paul's letters. In Romans, it occurs 15 times. And in our passage, it occurs twice. And this word, big picture again, is something that is used in the Old Testament, but especially in Isaiah. And those sorts of statements are helpful for giving the big picture and sorting things. You want to look at the number of times a word is used in different contexts, different writings, different authors. You want to talk about the primary meaning and also the cognates and antonyms and so on that we've mentioned earlier. You rise above the forest and you give the big picture before you zoom in on the particular tree you're discussing in your exegesis passage and the particular leaf you're discussing in a word study. And then finally, 7th, cite works properly. Since you'll be looking at primary texts, that is texts around about the time of the New Testament in Greek, then you'll be using primary sources, and you need to refer to those primary sources appropriately. Philo, a Jewish author in Alexandria, Egypt, in the 1st century, is contemporaneous with our New Testament authors. And his use of words is rather important. He writes in Greek. But when you refer to him, you don't refer to some translation of his work. You refer to his actual work. So you would say Philo, in his work called Special Laws, chapter or book 3, this passage, that's the way you cite it. Now, if you're going to quote it, you're going to be quoting a translation probably. So after citing the primary source, you need to put a little footnote, and then down in the footnote you say what the translation is that you used for that translation. Primary source references go in the text of your paper. Translations and secondary source works go in the footnotes. If you're referencing Luke chapter 3 verses 2 to 5, you would put that in the text of your paper. And in somewhere in your paper, at the very beginning of your paper, if you happen to be using a particular translation in English, like the English Standard Version, you would have a footnote the very first time, and you'd say that you're using the ESV, and you give the full reference to when it was published and where and so on. But then you can say, and throughout this paper, unless otherwise noted, that you're using the ESV, and you don't have to keep doing the footnote or saying that you're using the ESV. In exegesis work, though, you're going to be translating passages yourself, only if you're using lots of references to lots of passages and the translation isn't important. Might you use some standard translation? But wherever it's relevant and important to be using a translation or talking about the specific translation of words, you need to do your own translation at that point. Okay, so that's a word about translation and about the primary sources. You also, incidentally, need to note the author and article in a multi-author work when you cite. So, for example, if you're using a theological word dictionary like Kittle or Colin Brown or Moses Silva or these other editors who've produced multi-volume works with multi-authors, you don't cite Kittle, the editor. You cite the author of the article on the word dikaiosune, and you cite the fact that the article is called dikaiosune and what pages it's on, and then you cite the rest of the work in your footnote, saying this is in the work by Kittle, the work that Kittle edited, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, translated by Bromley or whoever, and the rest of the proper footnoting of texts. So one of the biggest mistakes I see in people writing papers is to cite articles by the editor's name, not the author's name, and by the name of the multi-author work, not by the article or chapter in that multi-author work. For all of this, you can get help with the Society of Biblical Literature's Handbook of Style. A student version of this is available online, and it's based on Turabian, so it just gives you some extra help to apply Turabian to biblical studies, and this is a helpful resource for you to use to get these things right. It's not difficult if you have a basic resource like that, and it's really not difficult if you're used to using Turabian. So now let's talk about some of the specifics we've already mentioned. When you're focused on the question at the very beginning as you translate about what words to do a word study on in a passage, you might consider these things. I mentioned doing your own translation work, but also alternative translations of the word in English translations can highlight that maybe that word needs to be looked at. If you're spinning your wheels, you might look at some different translations to get that kind of hint about the importance of some word study. Words that are ambiguous either in your translation language, English, or in the original language, the Greek. Words with synonyms and antonyms that enrich the possible scope of meaning are also interesting. Rare words are interesting. Words used figuratively are interesting. Significant words for the meaning of the passage are interesting, such as words repeated in that particular passage, or words that hold the key to the very idea being articulated in the passage. And of course, words with theological depth and meaning, at times obvious in meaning, but nevertheless interesting theologically. So let's look at a particular passage and consider choosing some words in this passage of 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15. You might read this in translation. Here's just the text, and so you could start circling words and say, I wonder if I should do a study on this. I wonder if I should do a study on this. Then you can look at the Greek and start your translation. You might note the following. Those words that are in yellow here are words I'm going to suggest in this passage would be worth studying in more depth for a word study. So we have the word katastole, which is a hapax legomenon in the Greek. That is, if you don't know what katastole means, you look it up in your lexicon, and lo and behold, you discover that it's only used once in the New Testament. That's called a hapax legomenon. It is written once, hapax, once. So that's a word worth looking at in more depth. Then the very next word, kosmio, is used 2 times in the New Testament and both in 1 Timothy. That's worth looking at. Then we have, similarly, eidos, which is only used twice in the New Testament and once in the Old Testament. Now, it may be that there's nothing special about it. It might be a common word, for example, in Greek, but because of its seldom usage, you're interested in making sure you understand the meaning of the word. Then we come to sophrasunes. It's used 3 times in the New Testament and twice in 1 Timothy 2. Obviously an important word to look at. You'll discover that it's a common word in Greek and in Greek philosophy as you look deeper into it. And then the question is Paul using it in the same way the philosophers are using it? Is there deeper meaning around that? Then we come to the end of verse 10, and we see the word theasabean. It's used once in the New Testament. And then we come to the word hesukia in verse 11, which is a key term. Women in silence let learn, the passage is saying here. Well, this is an important word for what we're understanding from this passage. What does it mean for them to learn in silence? It's a key term for the passage. Also, it's used 6 times in the New Testament, but 3 times in this very chapter of 1 Timothy. Then you come to manthaneto, a related term to others here, worth exploring further through though it's obvious what learn means. Then you have hupotage. It's a key term for the passage in all submission. Verse 12, we have authentane. It's a hapax legomenon. Here Paul's saying a woman shouldn't lord it over a man, but does it mean something more than lord it over? What does it mean to have authority over, to lord it over? Is it something intense? We have to look at that. There's our second use of hesukia in our passage. Verse 15 now. A woman, she will be saved through childbearing. Now, does that mean her salvation depends on having children? This theologically rich word could be translated simply as kept safe, as some translations have suggested, or like it has no theological meaning there, or it could have a theological meaning. And so we need to look at that as well. And then again, we have sophrosunes already mentioned back in verse 9. So all of these words are worth studying in a passage like 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15. This is how we determine which words should be given deeper study. Perhaps some others as well, but these are the ones I would suggest are rather important. So now we introduce the usage of some tools. And the first thing to do is to find where and how the word is used in other Greek texts. You've looked at these words in your passage. Now you throw open the question of all of Greek literature from antiquity, primary sources. How are these words used? And you would then use the Thesaurus Linguae Graeci, which is available through the Theological Library. And that would get you a way of finding out the usage of this word. Now, this is the most basic, the broadest approach, because you're saying in all of the Greek writing that has been kept, that we have available to us, where do we find this word? And that's a daunting task sometimes. It's not daunting if the word isn't used that much. But if the word is used a lot, you have a huge mound of passages you could look at. So the good news is that sometimes the words that are interesting to study are not that common. And so that does get you through some of the challenge. Other times you can begin with, say, a lexicon, and you can see some of the places, the passages that previous scholars have suggested are rather important to give you the diverse meanings, the options for a word. But this work in a Thesaurus Linguae Graeci is exactly what someone writing a dictionary today would do. They would say, all right, let's look at all the uses of this word. Let's come up with the range of meanings. That's what you're tasked with here. The Thesaurus Linguae Graeci I mentioned is available through the digital library at your theological seminary. It used to be available if you went into the library, you could get onto a computer that had it loaded there. You can do that remotely now if your library subscribes to it, and if you are a student and have access to that library. It's not available if you don't have that connection. And in that case, you'd have to use other resources that are available to you in a theological library, like lexicons and theological dictionaries. And then your own perhaps study of the use of the word in something you do have access to, like, for example, your New Testament. Or if you have an online Bible program like Accordance, you would be able to look at where the word is used in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, and any other texts you might have loaded or purchased through Accordance. So these are different ways to do the same thing we're talking about here. Now, when you look up auphentane using the Thesaurus Linguae Graeci, you actually are going to type the word into the box for search and then hit go. But to type it, you will use a keypad in Thesaurus Linguae Graecae that's right there on the page. It says input Greek, and then you click on the little keyboard icon, and then you tap out the letters and they appear in the search box, and then you hit the word go. Now if you do a lemma search, you're going to search for every form of the word, not just the verb in the third person singular or the aorist or something. You would then look for every use of the word, and then it'll show you what comes up. You see the box that's labeled selection here. What comes up are the inflection options and how many times they appear. And so that is helpful to know. And then you get authors. And if you click on those authors, you would get the passage in Greek. So you're going to want to identify that, but you don't have endless hours to wade through translations of all of this. So you're going to want to note where the passage is and then find that passage in an English translation. And so that will be something, a further stage to do. But at this point, you're trying to gather passages in authors that need to be looked at. Then you want to identify cognate forms, look at the context, pay attention to grammatical issues, look at synonyms and antonyms for the word to be studied. This has already been discussed, but let me focus on B here. After noting cognate forms, synonyms and antonyms, there is a resource by Lowe and Nida that is helpful because it looks at the concept and has a study of the range of meaning in that concept, and then it identifies the various Greek words that are used to capture the context. Colin Brown, or a theological word dictionary, will also do this. The Colin Brown and then the update of it by Moses Silva is a helpful resource because it also doesn't simply look at one word, but takes like the English word you look up in this resource, and then it'll give you various Greek words that relate to the English translation. So this helps, these different tools help you to study a word with respect to synonyms and antonyms. Now, a further word about context is that the word can be positive if it's God who is boasting. It can be negative if humans are boasting, unless humans are boasting in God. It becomes positive. So context is important then, not just the word in its raw meaning. And then grammatical issues. Pay attention to prepositions and their various cases that shade into different meanings for the translation, and understanding how the verbs change their meaning in different moods and tenses, different voices, and so on. Note the meaning in certain phrases. One of my fine examples of this is many years ago, struggling with my Greek. I knew the meaning of three words, epi, ta, auto. Now, epi is an awfully difficult word. It means it's a preposition that can be translated so many different ways. Often it can be translated simply as on. And ta means the, and auto means this. So I was reading along, and I read on the this, epi, ta, auto. Now, the professor I was studying with had written an article on the meaning of this word, these three words together. Together, they mean together, epi, ta, auto. And so you don't translate it as on the this, you translate it as together. So it was a particularly important phrase for him, and he was so shocked by my translation, which was wooden and literal and not at all capturing the meaning of epi, ta, auto, that he only made guttural noises for a while, and I watched him and tried to figure out what he was on about. And that was a lesson that taught me the meaning of the words epita auta, a phrase that means together and can't be understood just by translating the three words on their own. Well, there are numerous examples of that, and many examples, very humorous at times, of people trying to translate one language into another because they just don't understand the nuanced meaning of a phrase in the new language. It's not the same as in the original language. So, having chosen words of interest to study and noted cognates and context and grammatical issues and synonyms, antonyms, then proceed by studying definitions both diachronically and synchronically. Diachronic and synchronic word studies. Again, through time, diachronic is going to look at the changing of meaning over time. We can talk about the etymology of a word, how it has evolved from its original meaning. Take the word Istanbul, for example, the name of the city. It used to be called Constantinople. How did it get its new name? Well, in Greek, eiston pollen means to the city. And it seems that with a certain accent and the Turks coming in to the region, they would talk about going to the city, i.e. Constantinople, by saying something that sounded like Istanbul. Or take the word ecclesia. This word is constantly addressed in a bad way in sermons by ministers who want to go to the etymology of the word and not to its usage. Etymologically, it comes from two Greek words, ek kaleo. It means called out. And so sermons sometimes try to talk about the church as the ones who are called out. But that's not the meaning of the word. In the same way that Istanbul has its own meaning, it's the name of a city. It's not just to any city. And so this particular word, ecclesia, is regularly used for the word assembly in Greek. And it's assembly, it's a gathering of people. And it doesn't mean called out ones. Now, theologically, it does actually have a meaning because it's regularly the word that's used in the Old Testament Greek translation to translate the word kahal, which is the assembly of God. The people who are God's own treasured possession. And so ecclesia isn't simply an assembly, but used as special vocabulary, either by Jews or Christians. It refers to that special assembly that God has called into existence. So in that sense, there is a little bit of truth to what the pastors are trying to get at in their reference, but the word itself simply means assembly. Often we want to find more theological meaning in words than is actually there. Remember, people were communicating in their language and not trying to use words that are just dripping with alternative meanings to what the culture, how the culture used those words. They were trying to communicate so that others would have public access to the meaning of a work like 1 Corinthians. Now, when you identify authors and their works, you also want to pay attention to dates in particular for a diachronic word study. And for this, the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae can be helpful, as can many other sources, including encyclopedias that will mention ancient authors. Even a Google word search on an author will quickly give you that author's dates. Just make sure you have the right author. Here we have the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae that can show you the author's dates, the genre of the writing. Was it a tragedy or a comedy, for example? Is it a history? And also the location of the work. Was it from Athens? Since this is going to be used by people using different languages, we don't have simply the word Athens written here for Aeschylus in his tragedy, but we have Atheniensis written for Athens. So yeah, it's there. You just have to think a little bit for location, or you can go to some other resource. I just want to show you that when you're using Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, you can also use it for this purpose. A synchronic word study identifies the meaning of a word at a given time. We have seen in modern English words like cool, bad, wicked, beast being used for something nice. Words may change over time, so a diachronic study may not reveal the present meaning. I've already given the example of gay. A Greek example would be the word martus, which means witness. If you look it up in BDAG, you'll see this written. It can be used, number one, in a legal sense, someone who's a witness at a trial, or a non-legal sense, number two, especially in reference to attestation in response to noteworthy performance or communication. And then it can be used of one whose witness or attestation ultimately leads to death. Now notice with this third meaning that this is not the normal meaning of the word. You can't notice it from what's presented here on the slide, but you need to note that it's in a Christian witnessing that often led to death that the word martus shaded into a new meaning for the Christians as someone who was martyred, a martyr. So when we look at a diachronic word study, we need to remember that there's possibly a classical Greek usage of a word, 5th century, 4th century, 3rd century BC, and then moving into the common Greek period, the Koine Greek usage, in which we find our New Testament, but we also find significant authors like Josephus and Philo, or we find the Greek translation in the 2nd century BC of the Old Testament as Koine Greek. So we need to pay attention to the possible changes in meaning, and then also pay attention to the communal and temporal. A Septuagint usage of the word may well be the meaning of the word for a New Testament author, because it's their Bible that they're reading, and they are getting their theological and understanding of these words through the way in which for a couple hundred years the word has been translated. There's also the issue of a Second Temple Jewish usage. And then there's the New Testament and early church usage of terms, and then the post-New Testament usage as a possible separate usage. So we need to be concerned about that. If you look at Chrysostom's usage of a Greek word, you're looking at a native Greek speaker. However, he's coming from several centuries after the New Testament. And it may be that his Greek has changed somewhat from the way in which words were used in the New Testament. Often that's not the case, but you have to be aware of the possibility as you're doing your word study. Let's now look at our 1 Timothy 2 passage once again. You can see a column that's going to highlight a particular word. Then there's some notes in the middle column, and then some interpretations that are possible or have been suggested in the third column, just as a quick example of some of what we're talking about more theoretically here. So we come across this word silence, hysukia. Note it's in verses 11 and 12. And then in the middle column, note that 1 Timothy 2:2 has used the idea of silence already. Uh, 1 Timothy 3:4 is going to say something without the word silence, but that seems to be related to a theme that's going on in chapters 2 and 4. In chapter 3, verse 4, we read, "He must manage his own household well, keeping his children submissive and respectful in every way." Submission, respect, silence, these seem to be related ideas in this passage. So not just the meaning of Hesychia in chapter 2, but the idea that's being explored in chapters 2 and 3 is important here. And again, in 1 Timothy 3:7, moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders. That's also related to the idea of silence in chapters 2 and 3. So we can ask the question in the third column, what's the opposite of this kind of deportment? In the passage, the opposite is teaching with authentane over a man, whatever that means, another word study to do. Or later in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 13, it relates to, it's the opposite of being gadabouts, going from house to house, gossiping. So Hesychia then becomes not just a word study in a lexical sense, but a word study in the meaning that it has in 1 Timothy itself. We have the word let learn, or to learn, manthanein. The learning is an antonym for teaching. Instead of teaching, the woman should learn. Instead of teaching in a certain way, the woman should learn in a certain way. The opposite of learning in silence and obedience is to teach with authentane over a man. We can ask the question in interpretation, what the women were learning in Ephesus was not godliness, but to become idlers and gadabouts, as we saw in 5:13, ever learning but never coming to a knowledge of the truth, in 2 Timothy 3:7, and Paul calls them to another kind of learning. We also have words like obedience, hupotage. 1 Timothy 3:7 uses the same word for how an overseer's children should act. And to teach, clear enough meaning in the dictionary, didaskane, found in verse 12. In 1 Timothy, we see Paul is addressing a problem of false teaching. And while we don't learn a lot about what that false teaching is, we do learn that some of the false teaching involves women, involves teaching about them not marrying, and has engaged the women in the false teaching. Chapters 1 and 4 are particularly important in 1 Timothy. So the word's meaning is clear, but how is it being understood in this context? I want to introduce a theory called speech-act theory at this point. Speech-act theory says think about levels of meaning when they occur in communication. How are words actually used? They talk about words used in an act, or a speech being an act, some communication being an act. Well, at the most basic level, there's locution. What's actually said, the meaning of the words. That's primarily what we're talking about here. But in my examples here, I've pushed you beyond just the locution. Then there's speech-act theory talks about illocution, which is the intended effect of the word or words. And that's where you know what the word means, but then there's the question of what effect is that word going to have. If I talk about abortion in terms of the termination of a fetus versus murdering the unborn child, you can see that I have a very different view on what's going on with abortion. So we sometimes select words in order to convey the illocution. but sometimes we just use the word in a different way. Speech act theory likes to use the word hammer as an example. Someone originally, I think, used this word that way. So if I say hammer, I could just be making an observation. There's a hammer lying on the table. If I'm up on a roof and I say to someone else, hammer, I'm asking them to pass me the hammer. So the illocution is a request. It's not simply the use of the word, but it's a request. Well, when we get married and we say our vows, and we're not just saying vows, we're not just saying words, but we're actually committing a speech act that will bind us to each other for the rest of our lives in holy matrimony. So thinking about illocution is often important beyond just locution. And perlocution is a word that's used for the result. So if there's an intended meaning in illocution, perlocution points to the result of the use of words. So we could be asking these questions of locution, illocution, and perlocution when we're talking about word studies, when we move beyond the meaning of the word to how they're being used by an author in a text. The word authentane has been noted already, verse 12. It's a highly controversial word. I've suggested here the translation to domineer, over. It occurs only once in the Greek New Testament and in the Septuagint, so it's not common. Note that Paul chooses this word over the normal word for having authority over, which is kuriein, from the word kurios, meaning Lord. The term had various meanings, as we see in other Greek literature. You could use your Thesaurus Linguae Graecae to find those other meanings, or look up in a lexicon or in a theological word dictionary to see different meanings discussed. It has negative meanings. It can mean to have authority over, but that would be on the weak end, the weak side of the translation. It even seems to have been used on occasion to refer to murder. It could refer to assuming authority or control way beyond what was appropriate. It could also refer to initiating or originating something. And the word man in the phrase is in the genitive. So to have authority, man in genitive. Catherine Krager has suggested that older lexicons accepted the meaning of this word plus a noun in the genitive to mean that the author, originator, or source of something. So there's the question of a phrase with the use of authentane that needs to be looked at as well. Note the use of the word, note the use in Genesis 2 through 3. In our passage, the Genesis 2 to 3 does not have the word authentane in it, but it does in chapter 3, verse 16, talk about the relationship in the fall between the woman and the man. And this could be a further interpretation of what's going on in Genesis 3 with the use of the word authentane. It has a negative connotation in itself. Catherine Krager has gone on to explore the idea here in other ways. This is her interpretation. She suggests that underlying the problem in the church in Ephesus was the legacy of the Amazon women in the region and the contemporary cults of Artemis and Sybil. And similarly, she points out that the pro-Gnostic errors in the church may suggest the proto-Gnostic errors in the church may suggest that women were claiming that Eve was created before Adam and that Eve was the revealer of truth rather than one deceived. So is this interpretation of Krager's viable? I would suggest simply that Amazon women were a group that ranged very widely and weren't located simply around cults in Western Asia, Asia Minor. West Turkey today. And while there may have been a presence there, the fact that they were so far afield in different areas, it would make me think that twice about whether Paul would specifically have them in mind without addressing that as the issue. In fact, I don't think her interpretation is correct. It is true, though, that the Amazonian women were an example of women lording it over men. One text says that they would purposefully cripple their male children so that they would never be able to take authority to fight, and they were the warriors. The women were the warriors. Others argue the term is strongly negative without the ideas of Krager, and relate it to women who were refusing to marry and raise families in the church, for chapter 4, verse 3, or following demonic teaching, chapter 4, verse 1. And when found in other contexts, the association with teaching is lacking. It refers only to certain principles. And others argue the term itself is not negative, but simply means, like kuriane, to have authority over. And that's where we now get into the moving from the possible meanings of the word into our interpretation of the text itself. The other word noted was the word sodzane, saved, to save. The NIV translated this word as kept safe. The woman, she will be kept safe through childbirth. There's a good reason to reject that understanding. The previous verse is about Eve's deception and sin. She has transgressed. She's come into transgression. So over against that, she will be saved. Notice the verb is in the singular. It's not saying they will be saved, but she will be saved through childbirth. Verses 4 to 7 are about salvation, and verse 8 continues, therefore. 1 Timothy 5:15 is also to be noted. Already some have strayed after Satan. Some of the women have strayed after Satan through the false teaching. Salvation, then, is itself the issue in the church in Ephesus for the women, and what Paul seems to be doing with the singular subject is giving the analogy of what happened with Eve. Paul's point is to tie together the story of Eve with all women. He says she will be saved through childbirth provided they remain. And so he moves from the singular to the plural in verse 15. Timothy, by performing his duty well, will save himself and others. In chapter 4, verse 16. Deacons, by serving well, obtain a good standing and much boldness in the faith in Christ Jesus. Chapter 3, verse 13. The rich, by being wealthy in good deeds, will take hold of that life which is truly life. Chapter 6, verses 18 through 19. So salvation seems to be an issue for different groups and how they conduct themselves in their roles in 1 Timothy. And then also note again that Genesis 3:15 talks about childbirth. So this seems to be what's going on in the text. Further on this, Paul ties together personal salvation and a life of propriety. So phrasune, self-control, what is proper and right to do. It relates to how women should dress. It relates to salvation through childbearing, faith, love, holiness, and propriety or self-control. And then the concern for good works is here a respectable, orderly life runs throughout the pastoral epistles. 1 Timothy and Titus in these verses noted here. 2 Timothy is also concerned about the life of the congregation and also of Timothy himself. And then technogonia, childbearing, has been understood by some to refer to the Messiah. She will be kept safe through the childbearing of the Messiah, as it has often been understood. But I would again say no with 1 Timothy 5:14. Paul says, I would have younger widows marry, bear children, and manage their households so as to give the adversary no occasion to revile us. The heresy in Ephesus involves the forbidding of marriage. Paul makes note of that in both 1 Timothy and in 2 Timothy. Now, when we study the word in a passage, we're moving out into wider and wider circles. The word is present in a passage and then in the larger text, in the author. So in 1 Timothy 3:15, other places in 1 Timothy, other places in Paul, and then the New Testament, and then the patristic understanding of the passage and the use of the word. So again, the context, the most specific context is what's going to weigh on the meaning of the word, but studying the text in these other circles can help us get at the meaning of the word. So you may check your work then in lexicons and theological word dictionaries and possible grammars that are going to refer to the meaning of the words in other texts. And I've looked at the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae. I've already referenced some of the lexicons. I'm going to give you a list of various resources like this to check, including theological word dictionaries. And sometimes, and grammars where the grammar is the important part of the meaning of the word. So your own study of the passage where the word is to be found is important. You need to note any differences in prepositional phrases, verbal constructions, different authors and contexts, and so on. You need to come up with a semantic range over time. And for doing this, you need to use electronic databases like the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae or your accordance and other resources. We used to use concordances before all of this electronic stuff. A concordance of the Bible, a concordance of the Septuagint, a concordance for Josephus, or a concordance for Philo, which would list where the words are found in those authors and texts. Now we can do a lot of that electronically and therefore much more quickly. But if you don't have access to that, those resources for scholarly work exist on the shelves of theological libraries. Then you can compare your work with that of others in lexicons that cover classical, Koine, and patristic Greek. Then you can compare your work and the lexicons with theological word dictionaries. And it's basically an essay on the meaning of the word. And then if grammar contributes to the meaning of the word, you check the grammars. As you check for the uses in Greek literature, not only use the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae for your own work with texts, but also check with the Perseus Project. Now, the Perseus Project is able to give you the literature. It can usually offer a translation as well as a primary source, a Greek or Latin source. But you will also be able to search for a word in that literature in Perseus. So for example, you might get into some work of Aristotle's, but instead of reading through the work, looking for the word, you can just do a word search from the table of contents. And you can do that in Greek and then find the passage and then go to the English translation, or do the same with Latin if you like. So that is a very helpful resource alongside of the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae. And the difference is that you don't need a subscription or a library to use Perseus. It's online, it's free. You could also check with a Bible program that has literature that you can purchase yourself. And so the big ones are now accordance and logos in terms of purchasing something and adding primary sources to your own collection. There is a free one, though, through Tyndall House called Step Bible, and that will allow you to do a more limited kind of search in scripture, in the Apocrypha, and in some literature. And then, of course, you can check lexicons, concordances, commentaries, theological dictionaries as ways to find more material. And in this, I would say the commentaries are things to leave off of the assignment this time around, but that would be for the larger project and other courses and other studies that you're doing. Check with others. There are a variety of lexicons, as already noted, and you might learn something about lexicons in various languages to do with biblical studies from Tyndall House, which is mentioned first here. There's some open access to several lexicons through Tyndall House. Liddell Scott, the lexicon for classical Greek, is available in various ways online, through the TLG, through Perseus.com, for example. The patristic lexicon, edited by Lamp, is also available online, and an older edition of the New Testament and early Christian words, the lexicon BDAG, is also, I see, available online, although you should try to access the most recent version of that through your library. But I see the second edition is available if you sign up to this site. Earlier I mentioned the Louw-Nida lexicon that shows words that are synonyms and antonyms and gives you the concept of the word and then shows you the different words used for that concept. So that's a helpful alternative to the other kinds of lexicons. The Moulton lexicon is called the Analytical Greek Lexicon Revised. And then there's also a more recent work by Greg Beale, Daniel Bredsall, and William Ross, an interpretive lexicon of New Testament Greek, analysis of prepositions, adverbs, particles, relative pronouns, and conjunctions, 2014. We can use electronic resources to find words, so concordances are not always that popular for Bible study, but for other literature, they can still be quite relevant. And even using something in another language like French in this first example can be helpful when you're just dealing with concordances. So here are a few concordances, and the important point is to use what you need to use to find the words in the literature that you're studying. Some more concordances. And so here's a way of capturing some of these resources for the context, classical Greek and so forth, Septuagint. We have some concordances for these different groups of literature, some lexicons and some word studies. And just note in the bottom right, the word study by Brown has been updated with Silva, so that's why that's an arrow there. You could still use Brown, it's very helpful. Just be aware that there's an updated version. Then check theological dictionaries, and the famous one that's been used throughout much of the 20th century and up to today is right at the bottom by Gerhard Kittel and Gerhard Friedrich, the editors. It was translated in 64 through 76, 10 volumes. It's definitely dated. One of the problems with Kittel is that some of the earlier entries were written by German scholars who actually were part of the Nazi Party. So you actually get some concern about some of the writings some of the perspectives that they have on certain words, particularly around Judaism. But it's still useful, still worth consulting. It's 10 volumes and considered an academic standard. But that's not to say that you shouldn't check more recent works. And so Baltz and Schneider, in 3 volumes, I've mentioned the Silva update of Colin Brown, the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology and Exegesis. These are very helpful. There are some more popular types of word study studies that have been around for a very long time that you still find on people's shelves. I'm not suggesting you pick up a copy of Vine. These are just inferior to these sorts of works. Here's Moulton and Milligan, the vocabulary of the Greek New Testament illustrated from the papyri and other non-literary sources, and Sodaites, the complete word study dictionary for the New Testament. A simpler, less scholarly work has been produced by Bill Mounts, and don't use this for academic study, but it's not good for papers or articles, but it's useful, very useful. And so Mounts' complete expository dictionary of Old and New Testament words, a simpler resource. Then check grammars. It's already been mentioned, but here are the grammars listed. These are the grammars beyond the basic level of Greek grammar. The one by Blas de Brunner is an old standard in academic circles, revised by Funk. Andreas Kostenberger is more recent, produced with Merkel, and it's an update of Robert Plumer's work. Going deeper with New Testament Greek is the title now, an intermediate study of the grammar and syntax of the New Testament. Works like this can be available through a digital library of Theological Seminary. An important academic standard is that by Moulton and Howard, with a 4th volume on style by Nigel Turner. And the 3rd volume is also by Nigel Turner on syntax. All of these are very important and useful academic resources. An old study by A.T. Robinson on the grammar of New Testament Greek is noted here, and that's useful, although there are these more updated works, one being Daniel Wallace's Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. Note that he has an abridged version of this, so it gets you the same grammatical categories. The longer version is the one that would talk about more examples and more texts in New Testament as examples. So it's good to be aware of the longer version. And then also note that B&H Academic Publishing has a series of books analyzing the grammar of New Testament books. So for example, that's called Exegetical Guide to the Greek New Testament. But for example, there's a volume on Romans or a volume on John. And so if you want word by word, sentence by sentence, or verse by verse analysis of the Greek, these are very helpful detailed studies. Just remember that everything like that is a scholar's interpretation. And so one thing that you do find in B&H's Academics Exegetical Guide to the Greek New Testament, you'll find several options listed or several scholars that take a certain approach. So it doesn't only give you one perspective. There are some older versions of this sort of thing, working through the grammar of the New Testament this way, saying, for example, this participle is an adverbial participle, it's temporal, and some of the older versions don't give you options. This work will, so it's useful, very useful. Now, I'll conclude with another word study, and I want to use this as an example of how it's not just studying words in order to understand how to translate them, or even understanding the word per se in your exegetical study. But it's that by focusing on a word and trying to learn more about its usage, we get more deeply into exegesis. So this takes us beyond lexical study to theological interpretation of texts by focusing on words. And the word example I want to use is the word apantesis. This word apantesis appears in 1 Thessalonians 4:17. In the RSV, we read, "Then we who are alive, who are left, shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we shall always be with the Lord." In that RSV translation, we see the words to meet the Lord. Now, you'll notice that the Greek doesn't have the infinitive verb to meet. It actually has eis apantesin, which would better be translated a meeting. So what is this meeting of the Lord in the air? Well, as we look at this, we could look at the Old Testament and see how the word pops up and how it's used there. 1 Samuel 9:14, so they went up to the city. As they were entering the city, they saw Samuel coming out toward them on his way up to the high place. Okay, this meeting isn't like a meeting where you sit down and around a table and have a discussion. It's an encounter in this case, and one person coming toward the other person. Well, that sounds somewhat like 1 Thessalonians. 1 Samuel 13:10 says, "As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came, and Saul went out to meet him and salute him." So it's someone's out there and you go out to meet them. It's for a meeting again. Notice the verb is not what the Greek has. It's a meeting in the Greek. 1 Samuel 25:32 again. "And David said to Abigail, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me," for a meeting. Again, in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles, we see this language used. They went out to meet David. Saul came out to meet David. 1 Chronicles 14:8. David heard of it and went out against them. Now here the meeting is not a greeting, but a military encounter. In Josephus, we see the word used. This is more contemporary now with our New Testament authors. We have him using this phrase, eis apantesin, again, getting translated as an infinitive verb in the English. The inhabitants of Ascalon came out to meet him. And then in the Jewish wars, Josephus says, but hastened to meet him and advanced to a distance of over 30 furlongs, and so on. Again, back in the Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus says that the people of Ascalon came out and met him, bringing him presents, honoring him. Okay, now several of these going out to meet have to do with leaving the camp, leaving the city, to meet someone in a camp outside. And this is also similar to our 1 Thessalonians passage, where we are here on earth and go out to meet someone coming, that is Jesus coming on the clouds. So this passage shows that an entrance to a city is not required, only that the custom has in view coming out of the city to honor someone. But often the person is coming to the city and the group of people go out to meet the person as that person comes in. Staying in the city would be an acceptance of war in this case of Josephus, but going out for a meeting with presence brings peace. Neither does the passage imply going with the person somewhere else when one goes out to meet the person. Um, so you can see that I'm trying to say that we don't have to read this 1 Thessalonians passage, chapter 4, verse 17, as if we go out to meet Jesus in the clouds and then he takes us back to heaven. What is going on? Well, Jesus is coming to judge the earth. So like that situation here in Josephus, we have people going out of the city who take presents and will try to keep from being attacked. So those who go out for the meeting are seeking peace of the coming judge. Stepping outside of the Old Testament and Jewish usage, but also in a similar vein, we find some other Greek texts that capture this idea of asapentesin. On his arrival at Corinth, Leontius, Ptolemaeus, and Menelaus, who were army commanders, were at much pains to work up the soldiers to give him, Apelles, a fine reception. You see, this for a meeting is a reception here. After entering the city in great pomp, owing to the number of officers and soldiers who had flocked to meet him, there's our word for a meeting of him, he proceeded without alighting to the royal quarters. Here we have someone going out of the city to greet a person coming into the city. Again in Polybius a little bit later, Antiochus received the maiden on her approach with all due pomp and at once celebrated his nuptials with right royal magnificence. All right, so here we have the word being translated as received instead of for a meeting, which shows you the kind of encounter that takes place. And it's a reception of a person coming for a marriage. On this slide, we have a couple letters from Cicero written in Latin, and then also a work by Plutarch who is writing in Greek. Here I'm looking at the context around about the time of the 1st century. And the point is that we're not just doing a word study, but doing a study of a word that helps us understand what's going on culturally. Not looking for the lexical meaning of the word, but what's going on culturally. And so Julius Caesar is progressing through Italy in 49 BC, and Cicero comments, just imagine what receptions, meetings, he is receiving from the towns, what honors are paid to him. Another letter, he says, the municipalities are showing the boy remarkable favor, wonderful receptions and encouragement. And Plutarch says, as for example, when Caesar, after his victory in Spain, was on his return, Antony, among the rest, went out to meet him. This is a cultural practice. The general is coming to the city. Go out to meet him. You don't wait for him to get through the walls, through the gates, and he comes to you. You go to him. And then some other usage and context. Matthew 25:6 is the parable of the 10 virgins. And we read in verse 6, but at night there was a cry, behold, the bridegroom, come out for a meeting, come out to meet him. Clearly the bridegroom is coming into the city, but culturally you go out to meet him and accompany him back into the city. Similarly, in Acts 28:15, where Paul has arrived in Italy, we read, and the brethren there, when they heard of us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and 3 taverns to meet us. On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. The Christians had come out to meet him before he went into Rome. So then check lexicons as to the meaning of the word. Liddell and Scott offer the possible meaning of escort, but in the supplement to Liddell and Scott, this is deleted and replaced with read the action of going out to meet an arrival, especially as a mark of honor. We've seen this now in the text that we looked at. Bauer says that the noun means meeting and gives no discussion of its technical usage of going out to meet someone coming to the city. In the patristic lexicon by Lamp, there is no special meaning other than meeting, except meeting in argument, answering a summons, and appearance in court, not the practice of going out of a city to accompany someone back, like Liddell and Scott mentioned. And then check theological dictionaries. So, for example, in Kittle, the entry on apantesis is written by Peterson, and he says that the term is a technical term for a civic custom of antiquity whereby a public welcome was accorded by a city to important visitors. Similarly, when Christians leave the gates of the world, they will welcome Christ in the air, acclaiming him as Lord. The word became a loan word for the rabbis. The great of the city moved out to meet the king for a meeting. He says, and then in Baltz and Schneider, Latke says, regarding eis apantesin, the evidence offered by Peterson in Kittle is not so much proof for a technical term as for the existence and form of an ancient custom. This is the point I've been making, that it's not the meaning of the word, it's the custom that we discover as we study the word and its usage. And then we could look at a variety of views that have been suggested by dispensationalists. This passage in 1 Thessalonians 4:17 is understood to refer to the rapture in dispensationalist circles. Christians in that view will be snatched, will be raptured off the earth to meet Christ in the air and then taken to heaven during a time of tribulation. The text doesn't say that, but the text is used to support that theology. The argument for this position is offered by Robert Thomas in the Expositor's Bible Commentary, and he says regarding the word for snatched or raptured, harpage samatha, Christians being snatched away rather than advancing on their own to meet the visitors suggests that the technical Hellenistic sense of the word, of a formal delegation welcoming a visitor and ceremonially escorting him back to the city, does not apply. Thinks that the snatching is requires a different understanding. One might counter and say, how else are human beings going to leave the earth and get caught up into the sky? They have to be taken. So there's no reason to introduce a theology of the rapture. The Septuagint use of the noun apantesis does not have this technical sense, argues the dispensationalist view. However, we've seen counterexamples. And the point being here that you need to do your own work in the primary sources and don't take a scholar's comment like this for granted. Then he further says, tradition stemming from Jesus' parting instructions fixes the immediate destination following the meeting as the Father's house, that is heaven, John 14:2 and 3. Here he follows another dispensationalist, John Walvoord, in his commentary. Now notice that this is problematic for exegesis. You don't conflate two different authors and say, well, now we're going to help understand Paul in 1 Thessalonians by reference to John 14. The problem is using different authors in different texts, but more than that in this case, using different discussions of something so that you try to create a theology that neither author is actually advocating, but by conflating them, you've created something new. And that's exactly what takes place with this doctrine. And then Thomas says, a meeting in the air is pointless unless the saints continue on to heaven with the Lord who has come out to meet them. Well, why would it be pointless if the point is to receive the coming Christ? Because we are the ones who celebrate his coming and are not putting up our defenses as he comes to bring judgment to the earth. So the response then to the dispensationalist view is that 1 Thessalonians 4:17 doesn't refer to the rapture. Rather, it interprets Daniel 7. What is said of the one coming on the clouds in Daniel 7:13 and 14 is said of the saints of the Most High in verse 27 in Daniel. We'll have a look at that on the next slide. Paul takes the two statements together. The saints will join the one like a son of man in the coming on the clouds. The scene is one of being given dominion and glory, and this explains why the saints meet the one like a son of man in the air. As the word shows, their going out of the earth for a meeting with the Lord indicates that they are on his side, participate in his rule, and will be with the Lord forever. Paul's main point here in 1 Thessalonians 4:17 is pastoral. Believers who have died will not remain dead, but will be resurrected to participate in Christ's kingdom rule. Daniel 7:13 to 14, we read that, as I watched in the night visions, I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. To him was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. And then notice in that reading that you have the people enjoying the rule of the coming one from the Ancient of Days, the one like a son of man, translated in this translation, human being, in verse 13. And so too, in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul is saying the people are involved in the coming of the king. Daniel 7:27, the kingship and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people of the holy ones of the Most High. Their kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominion shall serve and obey him. If Paul is interpreting Daniel 7, there is nothing about taking these people away to heaven while there's tribulation on the earth. And in fact, that's not what Paul is saying either. Well, then, as we come to an end of this discussion of word studies, let's just have a checklist of things to look for. Establish the range of meaning in the wider context by looking at Greek in its different eras, classical Greek, Koine Greek, Second Temple Judaism, the use in the New Testament, use in the early church. Examine the semantic components, look at the grammar, look at the technical use in certain writings like Judaism, early Christianity, or other contexts. Look at cognates, synonyms, antonyms. Explore the translation. How was the word translated into other languages, like from Greek to Latin? Also, as you establish the meaning in your own passage, you'll be looking at the very narrow context of the use by the author in this text and in this passage. Engage with primary source research, use scholarly resources, and then present your argument. Be clear, concise, correct, complete, be descriptive, analytical, and critical. And that is how you do a word study and write up a paper to present your own work with primary texts.